Howdy and welcome to Chapter 12. In Chapter 12, we're going to talk about how organizations decide to establish pay structures. Here's a list of the objectives for Chapter 12, the things we're going to talk about and learn.
Pay can be a very controversial issue in organizations, so think about how you feel about these four statements as we go through this chapter. So pay is important in organizations for several reasons. It's a powerful tool for meeting goals, and it's a major cost. In some organizations, it can be up to 60-70% of the total cost of a company's product or service. It also has a large impact on employees' attitudes and behaviors. Pay is very important to people in organizations. It influences who is attracted to the organization or remains. Employees do tend to change organizations if they feel that they are being paid unfairly at their current organization. And also organizations are able to attract a better pool of applicants if the pay rates are competitive. And employees attach great importance to pay decisions when they evaluate that relationship. And that's why it becomes so important to employers as far as the perceptions of pay. So organizations basically make decisions surrounding three major areas concerning pay, and we'll talk about these. They are job structure, pay level, and pay structure. This diagram shows some of the issues in developing a pay structure, and we're going to talk about these next. This lists some of the legal requirements for pay, and we will discuss each one of these shortly. There are several legal requirements surrounding pay, the first of which is equal employment opportunity. And we learned earlier in the chapter about the Equal Pay Act and Title VII. So employers must not base differences in pay on an employee's age, sex, race, or other protected status. And any differences have to be tied to business-related considerations like job performance or responsibilities. So the goal is to provide equal pay for equal work. And this is what the Equal Pay Act states. However, as you may recall, differences in pay can be justified by things like job performance, geographic area, merit pay, etc. The Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal law that establishes minimum wage, overtime pay, and child labor regulations. The minimum wage you're probably familiar with is the lowest amount employers can pay per hour. Right now, I believe it's $7.25. The Fair Labor Standards Act also regulates overtime pay. And what this says is that if employees work over 40 hours per week, they have to be paid time and a half for those hours over 40. And this applies to non-exempt employees. An exempt employee would be a manager or someone on salary who is not covered by this law. And the law is very specific as far as who is not covered. Here's an example of how overtime is computed. This is a person who earns $12 an hour and they get a $40 per week bonus. So the bonus is part of their pay, so it has to be calculated in for the calculation of time and a half. So we calculate the pay for the first 40 hours and we add in the $40 bonus to get a total weekly pay of $5.20 before overtime. So we compute their hourly rate to be $13 per hour with the bonus. So their hourly overtime rate is $19.50. That's $13 at time and a half. So if they work 10 additional hours overtime, that's $195. There are also federal laws concerning child labor And there are also many state laws that regulate child labor and what age someone may begin working and in what type of occupations. These laws cover federal contractors, and what this says is federal contractors must pay employees at rates at least equal to the prevailing wages in the area. The economy has a huge impact on pay in organizations. So companies look at product markets. Product markets are the organizations that offer competing goods and services, much like the organization does. And organizations have to compete on quality, service, and price, and because labor is such a big part of cost, organizations have to consider the product market. They also need to consider the labor market, because this is where they go to get the human resources needed to make their products or produce their services. So they have to compete for labor in the labor market. So a major decision companies have to make is where to set their pay rates. And this is just a general broad philosophy. They could decide to set it at market rate so that they're competitive with other companies. But then they could also decide to pay above market. And companies who do this are trying to attract applicants from other companies who will come there due to the pay rates. Or they could choose to pay below market. And by paying below market, it's very difficult to attract applicants, but at the same time, a company is able to keep their costs low. So a company whose strategy is to be a cost leader would have this sort of a pay level decision. Companies can get information about the market rates in a couple different ways. They could benchmark, and by benchmarking, this means they're comparing what they're doing against those of companies they consider to be competitors, or maybe those companies they consider to be very good in their industry that they seek to be more like. So they will look at pay surveys. They'll look at professional groups like SHRM does pay surveys and that sort of thing. One important consideration about pay is how employees perceive the fairness of their pay. So what happens is employees tend to compare their pay and contributions against what they think other employees in the organization earn for doing the same job, what they think other employees in the organization earn for doing a job similar to theirs, and what they think other employees in different organizations earn for doing the same job that they're doing. They tend to make these comparisons. So opinions about fairness are based on equity theory. And what equity theory says is that employees compare their ratio of inputs to outputs versus other people's ratio of inputs to outputs. So what happens is I subconsciously will compute everything I'm putting into the job, like my work experience, my college education, how hard I'm working. I put all that in, and then I compare it to what I'm getting out, my compensation, my benefits, and that sort of thing. And I compare that ratio to the perceived ratio I have of other people. And keep in mind, this is based on perception. Okay, and perception is reality. So this is very real to people. And people make decisions based upon how they're perceiving this ratio. So if employees perceive they're being under-rewarded, their ratio is lower than someone they're comparing to, then several things happen, and they're usually counterproductive to organizations. They might reduce their effort. They reduce their inputs to affect that ratio, to bring it into balance. They find other ways to increase their outcomes. For example, stealing from the company. They might withdraw. This is usually the one that happens. They leave the organization, or they just refuse to cooperate. They kind of just tune out. So it's very important that organizations realize that perception has such an impact on an employee's behavior. So in order to determine what a job is worth, companies do something called job evaluation, not to be confused with job analysis. So job evaluation is the procedure for measuring the relative internal worth of jobs in the organization. So what happens is organizations determine the compensable factors, or those things that are very important to a particular job. Here's an example of a job where they determine that it has 5 compensable factors: experience, education, complexity, working conditions, and responsibility. So here's an example where the organization has looked at experience, education, and complexity in relation to 3 jobs. So you can see how the computer operator job is about half of the total points as systems analyst. So they would base how much to pay people off of these points, based on these compensable factors. The first thing is to identify key jobs. And these are jobs that have relatively stable content and common among many organizations. So it's easy to determine the market rates for these jobs because they're basically the same for every company. So if, for instance, a job like a cost accountant or systems engineer or, let's say, administrative secretary, whatever is very stable, it's kind of the same job at every organization. I can go out, I can get those market rates. So once I have the market rates for the key jobs, now I go out and I develop a pay policy line using those key jobs to do that. And from that, I determine the pay rates for the non-key jobs, or those jobs that are very unique or particular to my particular organization. So the next thing I do is create a pay policy line. So I do this by using the job evaluation points for each job, key job, that I computed in the job evaluation process. And then I plot that with the monthly salary that I found from the market surveys for the key jobs. So I plot these, and then I use multiple regression to develop a pay line. And then I can determine my non-key jobs this way. If I know, for instance, I have a non-key job with job evaluation points of 315, I can now use the pay policy line to determine that the predicted salary would be $6,486. Once I've developed the pay policy line, I can develop pay grades. Pay grades are just sets of jobs having similar worth or content that are grouped together to establish pay rates. So in this chart, it shows the brown areas are the pay grades for each job. So this particular company would have 5 pay grades, of which jobs would fall within those. So once I have the pay grades, now I can establish pay ranges. I'm going to establish a minimum, a maximum, and a midpoint of pay for employees holding a job within the particular pay grade. And usually the midpoint is the market rate, and then the minimum and maximum are a certain number of dollars from the midpoint. And as you get to higher labor grades, it becomes broader because you have to have more leeway with how to reward people. So companies need to continually be evaluating this system, and one way to do that is to compute the compa ratio for each pay range. So what happens is the salaries of the employees in that pay grade are averaged, and then that's compared to the midpoint of the pay grade. So what happens is if the average equals the midpoint, we come out with a comp ratio of 1. If it's greater than 1, that means the average pay is above the midpoint. If it's less than 1, then the average pay is below the midpoint. So if it's not equal to 1, a company needs to look at that and see if they need to adjust the pay ranges or what's happening in the market to cause this. Those are the main points for Chapter 12. I hope you didn't find it too confusing. I also posted an additional video, an older one I did some time ago about pay and establishing pay structure. So if you're confused, you might want to watch that as well. Thank you.